She was found alone, cold, and lifeless in a place no one expected. Not in some dark alley, not in a distant forest, but in the apartment she once called home. Her name was Elisa Gomez. To the world, she was just another name in a system overflowing with tragedy. But to those who knew her, she was a fighter, a mother, a daughter, a woman who had survived more storms than most, and who had just begun to believe in calm again. Until she vanished, and when they found her, the explanation felt far too simple. It was the winter of 2021, a year already haunted by a global sense of uncertainty. Elisa was living in Utah, working hard to rebuild her life after a difficult relationship. She had just secured custody of her children. She had a new job. And above all, she had hope, something not easily earned and even harder to fake. But hope can vanish faster than breath in cold air. The official story begins on December 15th. Elisa failed to show up for work. Her colleagues were concerned. She was reliable, responsible, and not the kind of person to disappear without a word. When her family was contacted, alarms went off. Her sister immediately began calling, texting, checking social media. No response. Silence. Not just absence, but complete suffocating silence. 2 days later, police arrived at the apartment. The door was locked from the outside. Inside, they found Elisa's body. The room was still. No broken glass, no signs of a struggle, but her body told a different story. Bruises, injuries, swelling. Her face was unrecognizable. The initial shock quickly turned into disbelief, not just for the family, but for anyone who saw the photographs. Yet despite this, authorities were quick to rule out foul play. The first statements indicated a possible suicide. Later, they shifted to undetermined. The inconsistencies began piling up. No autopsy was conducted right away. The scene was cleared too fast. Evidence was removed, and the person who held the key to the apartment, the one who had access and motive, was never treated as a suspect. His name was briefly mentioned in early reports. A man with a violent history, a documented abuser, someone Elisa had tried desperately to escape. She had filed reports. There were restraining orders, court documents, witnesses. Her friends said she lived in fear. Yet when she died under suspicious circumstances, those fears were ignored, buried with her body. The Gomez family began to ask questions. Why was the scene handled so quickly? Why were obvious signs of trauma dismissed? Why was no immediate investigation launched against the man she had accused of abuse for years? And why, above all, was no one listening? The case began to spread, quietly at first, then louder, shared through posts, hashtags, and grassroots movements. Online communities took notice. True crime researchers began digging into the timeline. Journalists raised red flags, but with every answer came more shadows. The autopsy report, when finally released, noted blunt force trauma, but failed to determine the exact cause of death. Toxicology showed nothing alarming, yet photos showed damage impossible to ignore. And still, the case remained closed. No arrests, no charges, no justice. In the next part, we'll examine Elisa's life before her death, the warnings she left behind, and the growing movement to reopen her case. Because this isn't just the story of one woman. It is the story of how systems fail, silence victims, and allow the guilty to vanish in plain sight. Before Elisa Gomez was found lifeless behind a locked door, she had spent years fighting for hers to be heard. Long before her name became a case number, Elisa was sounding alarms, quietly, persistently, and often in desperation. Those who knew her remember a woman who loved deeply, who laughed loudly, who gave everything to her children. But they also remember the fear in her eyes when she spoke of the man she once trusted, and the lingering shadow he cast over her life. The man in question, her ex-partner, the father of her children, was not a stranger to law enforcement. Court records document a long pattern of domestic abuse, harassment, threats, and violence. Police reports had been filed. Elisa had sought protection orders. She had even moved to escape him. But legal distance doesn't always translate into safety, and too often pieces of paper are poor shields against someone determined to do harm. In the months leading up to her death, Elisa told family and friends that she feared for her life. She suspected she was being watched. She reported suspicious behavior around her apartment. She changed routines, looked over her shoulder, and left digital breadcrumbs, messages, posts, voice notes that now echo like warnings no one answered in time. One message in particular, sent just weeks before her death, simply read, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation." Despite this, after Elisa's body was discovered, the man she feared most was barely questioned. He was never publicly named as a suspect. He gave a statement. He was released. No charges were filed. And from that moment forward, silence began to close over the case. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the one that hides discomfort. An official unwillingness to pursue answers that might lead to inconvenient truths. Elisa's family, refusing to accept the lack of investigation, began compiling everything on their own. They reviewed her final messages, tracked her last known locations, interviewed neighbors. One friend remembered seeing a man lurking around her apartment just days before her death. Another said Elisa had complained about strange behavior. Lights turning on, things moved around, noises outside the window. All of it documented, none of it taken seriously. Then came the photographs. After the body was released, images emerged that contradicted everything in the official summary. Elisa's face was swollen. Bruises lined her arms. There were marks across her forehead, lips, and throat. The coroner's report noted blunt force trauma, yet the ruling remained undetermined. How could trauma of that magnitude result in no further investigation? How could a woman with such a long recorded history of abuse be found in that condition and not spark deeper inquiry? The answer, according to many, lies in the systemic failure of domestic violence cases, especially those involving women of color. Elisa was Latina. Her case was not a media priority. Her story didn't receive the headlines or the police resources other victims might have been afforded. To some, it was just another tragic end. To her family and advocates, it was a miscarriage of justice so blatant it bordered on cruelty. And then, just when the pain seemed to settle into silence, a new voice emerged from within the police department. An anonymous source leaked information suggesting that internal pressure had been applied to keep the case low profile. Allegedly, the man Elisa had accused had connections, or at the very least, protection. Whether political, personal, or institutional, something kept the doors from opening. This revelation ignited a wave of online support. True crime communities, women's rights groups, and social justice movements began amplifying the story. Hashtags emerged. Justice for Elisa, say her name, open the file. Her family launched petitions, raised funds for private investigation, and began speaking to journalists. But as of today, the case remains officially unsolved. The autopsy stands. The silence continues. In the next party, we will follow the timeline of the final days of Elisa Gomez, her movements, her final messages, and the haunting details surrounding the apartment where she died. Because understanding what happened in those last 48 hours may be the only way to bring light to the darkness that consumed her story. The final days of Elisa Gomez's life are not documented by a camera or a signed confession. They are reconstructed through fragments, timestamps, voicemails, silent phone logs, and the uneasy memories of those who now wish they had looked closer. In those last 48 hours, something happened behind closed doors. Something violent, something silent, and something that no one with power seems willing to name. It began with a text, or more accurately, the absence of one. Elisa had been in daily contact with her sister. Every morning she would check in, share updates about the kids, or vent about work. But on the morning of December 15th, there was no message. By midday, her phone went straight to voicemail. It wasn't like her to go dark, and in her world, silence was never a good sign. That same day, Elisa's employer called the family. She hadn't shown up for her shift, no warning, no call, just an absence, like someone had pressed pause on her life. The family's first instinct was to go to her apartment, but Elisa's complex had recently changed locks, and no one had a key, except for one person. He was the last to have seen her alive. The man Elisa had fought in court, the one she'd named in affidavits. He claimed to know nothing, said he hadn't seen her, that she was probably out. But as night fell, dread settled in. Her sister drove to the complex, knocked on the door. Nothing. Called her phone. No answer. Looked in windows. Curtains drawn. On December 17th, after multiple wellness calls, police arrived and forced entry. Inside, they found Elisa, lifeless, cold, on the floor. The room was still, not messy, not destroyed, but the calm was deceptive, because her body told a different story. She was bruised, her lips had cuts, there were injuries to her face, to her chest, to her arms. The position of the body suggested collapse, not self-infliction. And yet the first note in the report read, "No signs of foul play." No fingerprints were taken. No forensic team examined the scene. No neighbors were questioned. Within hours, the apartment was cleared. It was as if the crime had never happened, but the pain had. Elisa's family arrived just after the body was removed. They were not allowed inside. They were given no answers, only a sterile explanation that the cause of death was pending investigation. But what investigation? No one interviewed the man Elisa had accused. No one followed up on her reports. No warrant was issued. No arrests. Just a woman dead and a system moving on. Then came the timeline gaps. Phone data later revealed that Elisa S.'s phone had pinged nearby cell towers after the estimated time of death. Her bank card was used. Activity on her accounts suggested someone else had access. But police never subpoenaed the data. Her phone was never recovered. It had vanished, like the evidence that could have saved her. CCTV footage from the building's parking area was requested by the family. The property manager claimed the cameras were not working. Another coincidence. Another closed door. Elisa's sister, increasingly desperate, began piecing together everything she could find. Text messages, voice memos, receipts, social media activity. One recording stood out. In it, Elisa's voice trembled as she spoke. "He came by again. I told him to leave. I don't feel safe." It was dated December 12th, 3 days before she died. Still, it wasn't enough. Not for authorities, not for a system unwilling to look beyond convenience. What happened in those final hours? Did Elisa let him in one last time? Was she forced? Was there a confrontation that turned deadly? Or did someone enter while she slept? What is known is this: Elisa didn't give up. She didn't disappear. She was taken by violence, by silence, by indifference. And the questions remain. Why was her death treated as routine? Why was the person she feared never investigated? Why do bruises not count as evidence when the victim is no longer breathing? In the next part, we will explore the aftermath. How the case was quietly buried, how her family fought to reopen it, and how a movement began to rise behind her name. Because the system may have failed her, but her voice did not vanish. Injustice doesn't always announce itself with a slammed gavel or a barred door. Sometimes, it creeps in slowly, through silence, through hesitation, through the invisible weight of apathy. For the family of Elisa Gomez, that injustice became a second grief. One they carried long after her body was buried. One they still carry, in courtrooms, in interviews, in vigils under cold skies. Because what followed Elisa's death was not closure. It was a wall, cold, high, and deliberately built to keep the truth from rising. The official statement remained firm, undetermined. Despite the bruises, despite the fear she documented, despite the silence surrounding her final hours, nothing changed. The coroner's findings were vague. Law enforcement declined further comment. No suspect, no charges, no movement. But something did rise outside the halls of power. Her sister became the voice Elisa no longer had. She began documenting everything. She opened files, scanned court records, released voice memos and photos. She spoke to reporters. She gave interviews. She contacted advocacy groups for domestic violence victims. And in doing so, she refused to let the silence settle. A petition was launched. Reopen the investigation into the death of Elisa Gomez. It gained thousands of signatures within days. The campaign spread across social media platforms. Hashtags like "Or Justice for Elisa" and "We Will Not Be Silent" appeared in timelines across the country. Not because Elisa was famous, but because she could have been anyone, a friend, a sister, a colleague. A woman whose voice had been dismissed because the system didn't want to listen. As the movement grew, attention turned to the man Elisa had warned about. His name had been redacted in police documents, his criminal history quietly pushed aside. But victims from his past began to speak. Women came forward with their own stories, patterns of control, manipulation, threats, and violence. None of them had been taken seriously at the time. Now, their voices joined the chorus echoing for accountability. Despite this, the justice system remained still. Prosecutors declined to pursue the case. The case remained marked inactive. There was no press conference, no reopened file, just a digital silence logged into a system and a family screaming into the void. And yet, something powerful began to form. Not in courtrooms, but in community. Vigils were held in Elisa's name. Domestic violence awareness campaigns adopted her story. Survivors spoke her name during public hearings. Artists painted murals. Activists wore her image on banners. Her story became more than tragedy. It became resistance. Because Elisa's death wasn't just a failure of one investigation. It was a mirror reflecting the quiet patterns of how violence against women is erased. Not by force, but by delay, by excuse, by red tape, by a shrug, by a locked door. And her story is far from the only one. In that silence, thousands of cases remain buried, unsolved, unacknowledged, forgotten by systems that were built to serve, but not always to protect. Elisa's name became a symbol, a name spoken not with pity, but with purpose.